The morning sun cast long shadows across St. George's Chapel as Duke Alexander Pemberton stood at the altar, his hands trembling imperceptibly. Behind him, the cream of London society filled every pew, their whispers creating a symphony of anticipation. But as his bride approached down the aisle, his eyes found another face in the crowd, one that made his heart stop and his world shatter. In that moment, he realized the magnitude of his terrible, irreversible mistake. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. The autumn of 1887 had painted the English countryside in shades of amber and crimson, but inside Pemberton Manor, the colours seemed muted, as if the very walls absorbed the light before it could truly illuminate the grand halls. Duke Alexander Pemberton, 28 and heir to one of England's most prestigious titles, stood before the towering windows of his study, watching the leaves dance in the October wind. "Your Grace," came the measured voice of his secretary, Mr. Whitmore, from behind him. "The final arrangements for the wedding have been confirmed. Lady Victoria's family expects the ceremony to proceed as scheduled next month." Alexander's reflection stared back at him from the glass, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of aristocratic features that had graced Pemberton portraits for generations. Dark hair swept back from a noble brow, and eyes the colour of storm clouds that seemed to hold secrets even he didn't fully understand. Yet beneath the polished exterior lay a growing sense of entrapment that he couldn't quite name. "Of course they do," Alexander murmured, his breath fogging the window. "The Ashworth fortune won't merge itself with ours." The engagement to Lady Victoria Ashworth had been arranged when they were both children, a strategic alliance between two of England's most powerful families. Victoria was beautiful, accomplished, and everything a duchess should be. Blonde hair like spun gold, porcelain skin, and a smile that graced the society pages of every London newspaper. She moved through ballrooms like a swan across still water, effortless and elegant. But when Alexander looked at her, he felt nothing, no quickening of pulse, no flutter of anticipation, no warmth spreading through his chest. Their conversations were pleasant but hollow, filled with discussions of weather, social obligations, and the management of their future estates. She was a perfect ornament for his predetermined life, and he was beginning to understand that he was merely the same for hers. "The guest list has grown to 400, Whitmore continued, consulting his leather-bound notebook. "The Archbishop himself will perform the ceremony, and the Queen has graciously agreed to attend the reception." Alexander turned from the window, his jaw tightening. "How splendid! A royal audience for our theatrical performance." "Your Grace?" "Nothing, Whitmore. Simply thinking aloud." Alexander moved to his desk, where wedding invitations lay scattered like fallen leaves. Each one bore the Pemberton coat of arms, a lion rampant beneath a crown, symbolizing strength and nobility. How ironic that he felt neither strong nor noble as his wedding day approached. The door to his study opened without ceremony, and his younger sister, Lady Margaret, swept in with characteristic determination. At 25, Margaret possessed the same dark hair and stormy eyes as her brother, but where Alexander had learned to mask his emotions behind ducal propriety, Margaret wore her feelings like badges of honor. "Alexander, you look positively ghastly," she announced, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "One might think you were attending a funeral rather than planning a wedding." "Perhaps there's little difference," he replied, earning a sharp look from his sister. Margaret dismissed Whitmore with a wave, waiting until the door closed before leaning forward. "You cannot possibly mean to go through with this charade." "It's hardly a charade, Margaret. It's duty. It's what's expected." "Expected by whom?" "Father's been dead 3 years, Alexander. You're the Duke now. You make the decisions." Alexander's hand moved unconsciously to the heavy signet ring on his finger, the weight of generations pressing down upon him. Some decisions were made long before I inherited the title. The Ashworth alliance secures our family's future, consolidates our holdings, and condemns you to a lifetime of misery." Margaret's voice softened. "I've watched you these past months, brother. You're like a caged bird, beautiful to look at but slowly dying inside." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. He had been dying inside, suffocating under the weight of expectations and obligations that felt increasingly meaningless. But what choice did he have? To break the engagement now would create a scandal that would reverberate through every drawing room in London. The Ashworth family would be humiliated, business partnerships would crumble, and his own reputation would be in ruins. "Victoria is a good woman," he said finally. "She deserves better than a husband who sees her as merely a beautiful stranger. Then why not give her the chance to find someone who can love her properly, and give yourself the same opportunity?" Before Alexander could respond, a commotion in the courtyard drew their attention to the window. A carriage had arrived, its occupants stepping onto the gravel drive with the confidence of those accustomed to grand estates. Lady Victoria emerged first, resplendent in a travelling dress of deep blue velvet, followed by her mother, the formidable Countess of Ashworth, and her younger sister, Lady Charlotte. "The bride-to-be arrives for her final fitting," Margaret observed dryly. "How perfectly timed." Alexander watched as Victoria glided toward the manor's entrance, her movements precise and practiced. She was undeniably beautiful, her golden hair catching the afternoon light, her posture reflecting years of deportment training. Yet as he observed her, he felt the familiar emptiness, the absence of any genuine connection or desire. "I should greet our guests," he said, straightening his waistcoat. "Alexander," Margaret's hand caught his arm. "It's not too late. Even now, it's not too late." But as he looked into his sister's earnest face, Alexander knew it was already far too late. The invitations had been sent, the cathedral reserved, the future mapped out in meticulous detail. He was Duke Alexander Pemberton, and dukes did not follow their hearts. They followed their duty. The afternoon passed in a blur of wedding preparations and polite conversation. Victoria discussed flower arrangements with the efficiency of a military strategist, while her mother reviewed the guest seating with the intensity of a chess master planning her next move. Lady Charlotte, barely 18 and possessed of her sister's beauty, but none of her restraint, flitted about the manor like a butterfly, commenting on everything from the tapestries to the servants' livery. As evening approached and the Ashworth ladies prepared to return to their London residence, Victoria found herself alone with Alexander in the conservatory. The glass-walled room was filled with exotic plants that his grandmother had collected from around the empire, creating a tropical paradise in the heart of the English countryside. "The arrangements are proceeding beautifully," Victoria said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of her upbringing. "Mother is particularly pleased with the cathedral's decorations." "I'm glad she approves," Alexander replied, though his attention seemed focused on a rare orchid that bloomed in defiant purple against the gathering dusk. Victoria studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw, the distant look in his eyes. "Alexander, are you quite well? You seem preoccupied." He turned to face her then, and for a moment she saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression. "Victoria, do you ever wonder what our lives might have been like if we had met by chance rather than by arrangement?" The question caught her off guard. In all their years of acquaintance, he had never spoken so personally, so intimately. I'm not certain I understand. Do you ever imagine falling in love? Truly, desperately in love, with someone who sees your soul rather than your title?" Victoria's cheeks flushed pink. "Such romantic notions are the province of novels, Alexander. We are fortunate to have found a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values." "Mutual respect," he repeated, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "Yes, I suppose that's what we have." But as he looked at her, really looked at her, He realized that even mutual respect was a generous description of their relationship. They were two beautiful strangers, bound together by contracts and expectations, preparing to pledge their lives to each other without ever truly knowing who the other person was beneath the carefully constructed facades. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced the Ashworth departure, and Alexander escorted Victoria to her waiting conveyance. As she settled into the plush interior, she turned back to him with a smile that was both radiant and somehow sad. "Until next week, my dear Duke," she said, her gloved hand briefly touching his. "Until next week," he replied, watching as the carriage disappeared into the gathering darkness. As Alexander stood alone in the courtyard, the weight of his impending marriage pressed down upon him like a physical force. In 7 days, he would stand at the altar of St. George's Chapel and pledge his life to a woman he barely knew, sealing a fate that felt increasingly like a prison sentence. But what he didn't know, as he turned back toward the manor's glowing windows, was that fate had already set in motion a series of events that would change everything. For in the shadows of London's bustling streets, another story was unfolding. One that would collide with his own in the most unexpected and devastating way. What force could possibly alter the course of a destiny that seemed so firmly set in stone? The morning of November 15th, 1887, dawned crisp and clear over London, as if the heavens themselves had conspired to create the perfect backdrop for what society deemed the wedding of the decade. St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle had been transformed into a cathedral of white roses and golden ribbons, their fragrance mingling with the scent of beeswax candles that flickered from every alcove and pillar. Alexander stood in the vestry, adjusting his ceremonial dress uniform for the 3rd time in as many minutes. The deep blue fabric, adorned with the gold braiding and medals befitting his rank, felt heavier than usual, as if each thread carried the weight of his ancestors' expectations. His reflection in the ornate mirror showed a man who appeared every inch the perfect duke, composed, dignified, ready to fulfill his destiny. Only he could see the storm brewing behind his carefully controlled expression. "Your Grace," his valet Stevens approached with white gloves. "The Archbishop is ready to begin whenever you are." Through the vestry's stained glass windows, Alexander could hear the murmur of 400 guests settling into their seats. The cream of English society had gathered to witness this union. Members of Parliament, foreign dignitaries, captains of industry, and enough titled nobility to populate a small kingdom. Queen Victoria herself sat in the royal box, her black mourning dress a stark contrast to the celebration surrounding her. "The bride's carriage has arrived," Stevens announced, peering through a crack in the door. "Lady Victoria looks radiant, Your Grace." Alexander nodded, though his throat felt constricted. In moments, he would walk down that aisle and take his place at the altar, where he would wait for a woman he didn't love to join him in a marriage that would define the rest of their lives. The irony wasn't lost on him that in a chapel dedicated to England's patron saint, a man who had died for his beliefs, he was about to sacrifice his own convictions on the altar of duty. The processional music began, its solemn notes echoing through the ancient stone walls. Alexander emerged from the vestry and walked slowly down the aisle, acutely aware of every eye upon him. The guests rose as one, a sea of silk and satin, jewels glittering in the candlelight like stars against a midnight sky. He recognized faces from countless social gatherings, the Duke of Marlborough nodding approvingly, the Countess of Pembroke dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, Lord Ashworth beaming with the satisfaction of a man whose financial future had just been secured. At the altar, Alexander took his position beside the Archbishop, whose kind eyes held a warmth that seemed to pierce through the ceremony's grandeur to the human drama unfolding beneath. The elderly clergyman had officiated at royal weddings and state funerals, had seen the rise and fall of empires, yet something in his expression suggested he understood the complexity of the moment better than anyone else in the chapel. The music swelled, and the congregation turned toward the chapel's entrance. Lady Victoria appeared in the doorway, like a vision from a fairy tale, her wedding gown a masterpiece of ivory silk and Brussels lace that had taken a team of seamstresses 6 months to complete. The train stretched behind her for 12 feet, embroidered with pearls and silver thread that caught the light with every step. Her veil, secured by a diamond tiara that had belonged to Alexander's grandmother, framed her face like morning mist. She was, by any measure, breathtakingly beautiful. Her golden hair had been arranged in an elaborate chignon, with delicate curls framing her face. Her blue eyes sparkled with what the society papers would later describe as bridal radiance, though Alexander wondered if he detected a hint of the same resignation he felt reflected in their depths. As Victoria began her slow procession down the aisle, accompanied by her father, Alexander's gaze swept across the congregation. He saw Margaret in the front row, her expression a mixture of concern and barely concealed disapproval. Behind her sat various cousins and family friends, their faces reflecting the appropriate solemnity of the occasion. But then, in the third row on the bride's side, his eyes found a face that made his heart stop entirely. She was perhaps 23 or 24, with auburn hair that caught the candlelight like burnished copper. Her dress was elegant but not ostentatious, a deep green silk that complemented her coloring without drawing undue attention. She wasn't the most beautiful woman in the chapel by conventional standards, but there was something about her that commanded Alexander's complete attention. Her eyes, a warm brown flecked with gold, held an intelligence and depth that seemed to see straight through the pageantry to the truth beneath. More unsettling still was the expression on her face. While every other guest wore the appropriate mask of wedding day joy, she looked sad, not the gentle melancholy that sometimes accompanied weddings, but a profound sorrow that seemed to emanate from her very soul. Her hands, encased in simple white gloves, were clasped tightly in her lap, and Alexander could see the tension in her shoulders despite her composed posture. Who was she? How had he never noticed her before at any of the countless social gatherings he'd attended? And why did the sight of her fill him with such an overwhelming sense of recognition, as if he'd been searching for her his entire life without knowing it? Victoria had reached the halfway point of the aisle when Alexander's attention was drawn back to her by a subtle change in the atmosphere. The bride's steps had slowed almost imperceptibly, and her radiant smile had faltered. Following her gaze, Alexander saw that she too was looking at someone in the congregation, but not the mysterious woman who had captured his attention. Instead, Victoria's eyes were fixed on a man seated in the fourth row. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair and the kind of rugged handsomeness that suggested a life lived outdoors rather than in drawing rooms. His clothing marked him as a gentleman, but not of the highest rank, a country squire perhaps, or a successful merchant. What struck Alexander most forcefully was the way the man was looking at Victoria, with an expression of such raw longing and pain that it was almost indecent to witness. The man's presence seemed to affect Victoria profoundly. Her already pale complexion grew ashen, and her step faltered so noticeably that her father, Lord Ashworth, tightened his grip on her arm and whispered something urgent in her ear. She recovered quickly, her training taking over, but not before Alexander saw her hands tremble against her bouquet of white roses and orange blossoms. The processional continued, but the atmosphere in the chapel had shifted subtly. Those guests closest to the drama seemed to sense that something was amiss, though they couldn't quite identify what. Whispers began to ripple through the congregation, like wind through wheat, barely audible but unmistakably present. When Victoria finally reached the altar, her father placed her hand in Alexander's with the solemnity of a man transferring a precious but fragile treasure. Her fingers were ice-cold despite her gloves, and Alexander could feel them trembling against his palm. For the first time in their long acquaintance, he felt a genuine surge of protectiveness toward her, recognizing in her distress an echo of his own inner turmoil. The archbishop began the ancient ceremony, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel's vaulted spaces. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered together here in the sight of God, and in the face of this congregation, to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." But Alexander found his attention wandering again to the woman in green. She had lowered her gaze to her hands, but he could see the tension in her profile, the way she held herself as if braced against some invisible blow. There was something familiar about the curve of her cheek, the way she tilted her head, that nagged at the edges of his memory. "Which is an honorable estate, instituted of God in the time of man's innocency, signifying unto us the mystical union that is betwixt Christ and his church." The words washed over Alexander like water, meaningful yet somehow distant. He was acutely aware of Victoria beside him, of her continued trembling, of the way she kept glancing toward the man in the fourth row. Whatever history existed between them, it was clearly significant enough to shake her composure on what should have been the happiest day of her life. Therefore, if any man can show any just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace. The traditional words hung in the air like a challenge. In all the weddings Alexander had attended, this moment had always passed in respectful silence, a mere formality before the ceremony continued. But today, something was different. The silence stretched longer than usual, heavy with unspoken tensions and hidden truths. And then, to everyone's shock, a voice rang out from the congregation. "I object." The words seemed to echo endlessly in the sudden, absolute silence that followed. 400 guests turned as one toward the source of the interruption, their faces reflecting various degrees of shock, outrage, and fascination. Even Queen Victoria leaned forward in her seat, her usual composure momentarily forgotten. The man in the fourth row had risen to his feet, his face pale but determined. Alexander could see now that he was younger than he'd first appeared, perhaps 28 or 29, with the kind of honest, open features that suggested a man unaccustomed to deception or social maneuvering. "I object," he repeated, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel, despite its obvious strain. "This marriage cannot proceed." Lord Ashworth's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. "How dare you?" he sputtered, starting toward the man. "This is an outrage. Guards, remove this person immediately." But the archbishop, with the wisdom of his years and position, raised a hand for calm. "Sir," he addressed the objector with grave dignity, "you understand the seriousness of your interruption. What grounds do you claim for this objection?" The man straightened his shoulders, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, despite the magnitude of what he was doing. "My name is Captain James Morrison, late of Her Majesty's Army. I object because Lady Victoria Ashworth is already married to me." The silence that followed was so complete that Alexander could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Victoria swayed beside him, and he instinctively reached out to steady her, though his own world was spinning off its axis. "That's impossible," Lord Ashworth roared. "Victoria, tell them this man is lying." All eyes turned to the bride, who stood frozen at the altar like a beautiful statue. Her bouquet trembled in her hands, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's true." The chapel erupted. Guests leaped to their feet, voices raised in shock and indignation. Ladies fanned themselves frantically, while gentlemen demanded explanations. The Queen's guards moved closer to the royal box, uncertain whether this constituted a threat to Her Majesty's safety. Through the chaos, Alexander heard fragments of conversation. Secret marriage. Scandal of the century. Poor Duke. How could she? But his attention was fixed on Victoria, who had begun to speak in a voice that grew stronger with each word, as if the truth was giving her courage she hadn't possessed moments before. "James and I were married 3 months ago," she said, her words cutting through the din like a blade. "In Scotland, at Gretna Green. I couldn't go through with this charade any longer. Lord Ashworth looked as if he might suffer an apoplectic fit. Victoria, you don't know what you're saying. The shock has addled your wits. No, father. Victoria turned to face the congregation, her chin raised with newfound defiance. For the first time in my life, I know exactly what I'm saying. I married James because I love him, and I will not pledge myself to another man when my heart and my vows already belong to him. The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. Not because his heart was broken, he realized with startling clarity that it wasn't, but because of what it revealed about the life he'd been sleepwalking toward. Victoria had found the courage to choose love over duty, to risk everything for the chance at genuine happiness. And in doing so, she had inadvertently given him the same opportunity. Captain Morrison had made his way to the altar, pushing through the crowd of agitated guests with single-minded determination. When he reached Victoria, he took her hands in his, and the look that passed between them was so intimate, so filled with genuine love and relief, that Alexander felt like an intruder witnessing it. "I'm sorry," Victoria said, turning to Alexander with tears streaming down her face. "I'm so terribly sorry. I tried to go through with it, I truly did, but when I saw James in the congregation, I realized I couldn't live a lie for the rest of my life." Alexander found his voice at last, though it sounded strange to his own ears. "You have nothing to apologize for, Victoria. You've done what I lacked the courage to do." The Archbishop, displaying remarkable composure given the circumstances, stepped forward. "If what you say is true, Lady Victoria, or rather Mrs. Morrison, then this ceremony cannot proceed. A valid marriage already exists." "It's true," Captain Morrison said, producing a folded document from his jacket. "Here is our marriage certificate, properly witnessed and recorded." As the Archbishop examined the document, Alexander became aware of the woman in green again. She had remained seated throughout the chaos, her hands still clasped in her lap, but now she was looking directly at him. Their eyes met across the tumultuous scene, and in that moment something passed between them. A recognition, an understanding, a connection that transcended the madness surrounding them. She was beautiful, he realized, but not in the conventional way that Victoria was beautiful. Her beauty was deeper, more complex, like a piece of music that revealed new layers with each listening. And in her eyes, he saw something he'd never seen in Victoria's, a genuine interest in him as a person, rather than as a title or a social position. The Archbishop's voice cut through his reverie. "The certificate appears to be genuine and properly executed. This ceremony cannot continue." What followed was perhaps the most spectacular social disaster in recent memory. Lord Ashworth collapsed into a pew, fanning himself with his top hat while his wife administered smelling salts. The Queen's party made a dignified but hasty exit, Her Majesty's expression suggesting that heads would roll for this breach of protocol. Guests streamed toward the exits, already composing the letters and telegrams that would spread news of the scandal across the empire before nightfall. Through it all, Alexander stood at the altar in his ceremonial uniform, watching his carefully planned future crumble around him. He should have felt devastated, humiliated, angry. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: relief. Victoria and her captain had disappeared into the vestry with the Archbishop, presumably to sort out the legal implications of the situation. Margaret appeared at Alexander's side, her face a mixture of concern and barely suppressed triumph. "Are you all right?" she asked, taking his arm. "I think," Alexander said slowly, "I may be better than I've been in years." As they made their way toward the chapel's exit, Alexander found himself scanning the departing crowd for a glimpse of green silk. But the mysterious woman had vanished as completely as if she'd been a figment of his imagination, leaving him with nothing but questions and a growing certainty that his life had just taken a turn towards something entirely unexpected. The scandal would dominate London society for months to come. The financial implications alone would require teams of lawyers to untangle. His reputation would need careful management to survive the humiliation. But as Alexander stepped out of St. George's Chapel into the crisp November air, breathing freely for the first time in months, he couldn't help but wonder, who was the woman in green, and would he ever see her again? The scandal of the Duke of Pemberton's abandoned wedding spread through London society like wildfire through dry timber. Within hours of the chapel debacle, every drawing room from Mayfair to Belgravia buzzed with whispered accounts of the extraordinary scene. The newspapers, initially prepared to report on the social event of the season, scrambled to rewrite their headlines. "Duke left at altar in royal scandal," proclaimed the Times, while more sensational publications delighted in every salacious detail they could uncover or invent. Alexander retreated to Pemberton Manor immediately following the disaster, but even the countryside offered little sanctuary from the storm of public attention. Reporters lurked behind hedgerows, society matrons arrived uninvited with casseroles and unsolicited advice, and the Morning Post brought an avalanche of letters ranging from expressions of sympathy to thinly veiled social invitations from ambitious mothers, suddenly viewing him as an available prize once again. For 3 weeks, he endured the siege with characteristic stoicism, but by early December, the walls of his ancestral home felt more like a prison than a refuge. It was Margaret who finally provided the solution, arriving one grey morning with a proposal that would change everything. "You cannot continue hiding here like a wounded animal," she declared, sweeping into his study with her usual dramatic flair. At 25, Margaret possessed all the Pemberton determination, but none of their traditional restraint. Her dark hair was pinned in a fashionably loose style that suggested both propriety and rebellion, and her travelling dress of deep burgundy wool spoke of someone prepared for immediate action. "I'm not hiding," Alexander protested, though the stack of unopened correspondence on his desk suggested otherwise. "I'm simply regrouping." "You're wallowing," Margaret corrected bluntly. "And while I understand the impulse, it's time to rejoin the world. Aunt Cordelia has extended an invitation for you to spend the winter season with her in Bath." Alexander looked up from the estate ledgers he'd been pretending to review. "Aunt Cordelia? I haven't seen her in years." "Precisely why she's perfect. She's been living in Bath since Uncle Edmund died, completely removed from London society's gossip mill. She has her own circle of friends, intellectuals, artists, reformers, people who care more about ideas than scandals." The prospect was intriguing. Lady Cordelia Pemberton had been the family's acknowledged eccentric for as long as Alexander could remember. The youngest daughter of his grandfather, she had shocked society by marrying a scholar rather than a title, then compounded the offence by involving herself in various progressive causes. After her husband's death 5 years earlier, she had settled in Bath, where she hosted salons that attracted some of the most interesting minds in England. She writes that Bath society is refreshingly different from London, Margaret continued, producing a letter from her reticule. "Less concerned with bloodlines and bank accounts, more interested in genuine conversation and intellectual pursuits. It might be exactly what you need." Alexander considered the proposal. Bath had been fashionable during the previous century, when Jane Austen had immortalized its social rituals in her novels. Now it attracted a different sort of visitor, those seeking the healing waters certainly, but also artists, writers and thinkers who found London's rigid social hierarchy stifling. It would be a complete change from everything he'd known. "What does she say about recent events?" he asked. Margaret smiled. "She writes, and I quote, 'Tell my nephew that any man who escapes marriage to a woman he doesn't love should count himself blessed, regardless of the circumstances. The only tragedy would be wasting this opportunity for a fresh start.'" 3 days later, Alexander found himself on the Great Western Railway, watching the English countryside roll past his compartment window as the train carried him toward Bath. He had packed lightly, bringing only essential clothing and a selection of books he'd been meaning to read. For the first time in months, he felt a stirring of something that might have been anticipation. Bath revealed itself gradually as the train approached the city, its honey-coloured Georgian architecture rising from the valley like something from a classical dream. The royal crescent curved gracefully along the hillside, its uniform facade creating an impression of elegant harmony that spoke to Alexander's architectural sensibilities. Even in December, with bare trees and grey skies, the city possessed a timeless beauty that seemed to promise refuge from the storms of contemporary life. Aunt Cordelia met him at the station personally, a breach of protocol that would have scandalized London society but seemed perfectly natural in Bath's more relaxed atmosphere. At 58, she remained a striking woman, her silver hair arranged in a style that was both fashionable and practical, her clothing elegant but comfortable. Her eyes, the same storm grey as Alexander's own, sparkled with intelligence and warmth. "Alexander, my dear boy," she said, embracing him with genuine affection, "you look positively haggard. We shall have to remedy that immediately." Her house on the Royal Crescent was smaller than Pemberton Manor, but infinitely more welcoming. The rooms were filled with books, paintings, and curiosities collected during her travels with Uncle Edmund. Comfortable chairs invited long conversations, and every surface seemed to hold some interesting artifact or volume that begged examination. "I've taken the liberty of arranging a small gathering for this evening," Cordelia announced, as they settled in her drawing room for tea. "Nothing formal, simply a few friends who share interesting perspectives on the world. I thought you might enjoy some stimulating conversation after your recent difficulties." That evening, Alexander found himself in a social situation unlike any he'd previously experienced. Cordelia's guests included a retired professor of classics from Oxford, a lady novelist who wrote under a masculine pseudonym, a young doctor who had studied in Edinburgh and Vienna, and a painter whose landscapes had begun attracting attention in London galleries. The conversation ranged from archaeological discoveries in Greece to the latest developments in medical science, from social reform movements to the changing role of women in society. For the first time in months, Alexander felt his mind truly engaged. These people discussed ideas with passion and intelligence, challenging each other's assumptions without the careful politeness that characterized London drawing rooms. He found himself contributing to debates about everything from Irish Home Rule to the latest theories about human psychology, discovering opinions he hadn't known he possessed. "You have an interesting perspective on economic theory," observed Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, the lady novelist, during a discussion of industrial working conditions. "Have you given much thought to the social implications of inherited wealth?" The question was exactly the sort that would never be asked in polite society, where inherited wealth was simply an accepted fact of life. But here, among Cordelia's eclectic circle, it seemed perfectly reasonable to examine even the foundations of one's own existence. "I confess, I've been questioning many assumptions lately," Alexander replied honestly. "Recent events have forced me to reconsider what I truly value, what kind of life I want to lead." "Recent events have a way of clarifying one's priorities," agreed Professor Whitfield, the classicist. "The ancient Greeks believed that true wisdom came only through suffering. Perhaps your recent difficulties are actually a gift in disguise." As the evening progressed, Alexander found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The conversation was intellectually stimulating without being competitive, warm without being intrusive. These people seemed to accept him simply as Alexander, not as the Duke of Pemberton, with all the expectations and assumptions that title carried. It was near midnight when the last guest departed, leaving Alexander alone with his aunt in the comfortable disorder of her drawing room. Cordelia poured herself a small brandy and settled into her favourite chair, studying her nephew with shrewd eyes. "You seem surprised by the evening," she observed. "I suppose I am. In London, conversation tends to be more constrained. People say what's expected rather than what they think." One of the advantages of living outside London's social fishbowl, Cordelia replied. Here, people are more interested in who you are than what you represent. It's quite liberating once you adjust to it. Alexander considered this as he gazed into the dying fire. I'm not certain I know who I am, apart from what I represent. I've been the Duke of Pemberton for so long that I'm not sure there's anything else underneath. Nonsense, Cordelia said briskly. You're an intelligent, thoughtful man who's been trapped in a role that doesn't suit him. Tonight proved that. You engaged with ideas, expressed genuine opinions, showed real curiosity about the world. That's who you are when you're not performing the part of a duke. Over the following weeks, Alexander settled into a routine that was both foreign and deeply satisfying. He took long walks through Bath's elegant streets, visited the Roman baths that gave the city its name, and spent hours in the lending library discovering authors he'd never had time to read. Cordelia's circle welcomed him warmly, and he found himself looking forward to their gatherings with an enthusiasm he'd never felt for London's social obligations. It was during his third week in Bath that he encountered her again. He was browsing in Hatchard's bookshop, searching for a volume of Wordsworth's poetry that Professor Whitfield had recommended, when he heard a familiar voice from the next aisle. The sound stopped him cold, his hand frozen halfway to the shelf. I'm looking for anything by Mary Wollstonecraft, the voice was saying, particularly a vindication of the rights of woman, if you have it. Alexander moved quietly to the end of the aisle and peered around the corner. There she was, the woman in green from the chapel, though today she wore a practical walking dress of deep blue wool. Her auburn hair was partially hidden beneath a small hat, but he recognized the intelligent brown eyes, the graceful way she held herself, the aura of quiet strength that had captured his attention so completely during those chaotic moments at the altar. She was speaking with the elderly proprietor, who was shaking his head apologetically. I'm afraid that particular volume is quite difficult to obtain, miss. Not much call for it, you understand. Perhaps something by Mrs. Gaskell instead? I understand, she replied with a smile that was both gracious and slightly disappointed. Mrs. Gaskell is wonderful, of course, but I was particularly interested in Wollstonecraft's arguments about women's education. Alexander found himself stepping forward before he'd consciously decided to do so. Excuse me, he said, his heart beating faster than the simple interaction warranted. I couldn't help overhearing. My aunt has a copy of Wollstonecraft's work in her library. I'm certain she would be delighted to lend it to a fellow enthusiast. The woman turned toward him, and he saw recognition dawn in her eyes. For a moment, neither spoke, the memory of that extraordinary day at St. George's Chapel hanging between them like an unspoken question. Your Grace, she said finally, offering a small curtsy that seemed more automatic than deferential. I didn't expect to encounter you here. Please, Alexander said quickly. Just Alexander. And you are Miss Evelyn Sinclair. She hesitated, then added, I was at your... That is, I attended the ceremony at St. George's Chapel. Yes, I remember seeing you. The understatement felt absurd, given how completely her image had haunted his thoughts since that day. You looked concerned. A faint blush colored her cheeks. It was a rather extraordinary situation. I felt for everyone involved. The bookshop proprietor had tactfully withdrawn to give them privacy, leaving them alone among the towering shelves of leather-bound volumes. Alexander found himself studying her face, noting details he'd missed during those brief moments in the chapel. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow, barely visible unless one looked closely. Her hands, ungloved for browsing books, showed signs of practical work, not the pampered softness of a lady of leisure. Everything about her suggested intelligence, independence, and a life lived on her own terms. Are you visiting Bath? He asked, desperate to keep the conversation going. I live here now, she replied. I moved from London several months ago. to take a position as a governess with the Thornfield family. They're quite progressive. They encourage my continued education and allow me considerable freedom to pursue my own interests. A governess. That explained her presence at the wedding. She must have been accompanying her employers. It also explained the quality of her dress, elegant but not extravagant, and her obvious education combined with her need to work for her living. And your interest in Mary Wollstonecraft? Alexander found himself genuinely curious about her thoughts. A novel experience after years of conversations that rarely ventured beyond weather and social pleasantries. Evelyn's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. I believe education is the key to women's advancement in society. Wollstonecraft argued that women's supposed intellectual inferiority stems from lack of opportunity rather than natural incapacity. It's a revolutionary idea, even now. Revolutionary indeed, Alexander agreed, thinking of the women in his London circle, most of whom had been educated primarily in accomplishments designed to attract husbands. Do you find your employers supportive of such views? Mrs. Thornfield is remarkably enlightened. She believes her daughters should be prepared for any eventuality, including the possibility of supporting themselves. It's refreshing to work in a household where intellectual curiosity is encouraged rather than discouraged. As they talked, Alexander found himself drawn deeper into conversation with this remarkable woman. She spoke with passion about education, social reform, and the changing world around them. Her opinions were well-informed and thoughtfully expressed, her questions challenging without being confrontational. Most remarkably, she seemed to see him as simply a man with interesting ideas, rather than a duke whose every word required careful consideration. I should mention that offer of the Wollstonecraft volume, Alexander said, as their conversation began to wind down. My aunt, Lady Cordelia Pemberton, hosts informal gatherings where such topics are frequently discussed. You might find them interesting, and I know she would welcome another thoughtful voice. Evelyn hesitated. That's very kind, but I'm not certain it would be appropriate. The difference in our social positions. In my aunt's drawing room, ideas matter more than titles, Alexander assured her. She judges people by their minds and hearts, not their birth or bank accounts. Something in his tone must have convinced her, because she nodded slowly. If you're certain it wouldn't be presumptuous. I'm certain. In fact, I believe you and my aunt would find each other fascinating company. As they parted ways outside the bookshop, Alexander felt a lightness he hadn't experienced since, perhaps ever. For the first time in his adult life, he had met a woman who interested him not for her beauty or social connections, but for her mind and spirit. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Walking back to the Royal Crescent, he found himself analyzing every moment of their conversation, every expression that had crossed her face, every inflection in her voice. Miss Evelyn Sinclair was unlike any woman he'd ever encountered. Intelligent, independent, passionate about ideas that mattered. She worked for her living, thought for herself, and seemed utterly unimpressed by his title or wealth. For a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from him, the experience was revolutionary. But as he climbed the steps to Cordelia's house, a sobering thought struck him. What could he possibly offer a woman like Evelyn Sinclair? She had built a life based on her own merits, her own choices. She was free in a way he was only beginning to understand. What right did he have to complicate that freedom with his own confused feelings and uncertain future? The question would haunt him through the evening and into the sleepless hours of the night, as he lay in his comfortable bed, wondering if he would have the courage to see her again, and what might happen if he did. The invitation arrived on a crisp January morning, delivered by a liveried footman whose presence on the Royal Crescent caused several curtains to twitch with curiosity. Alexander recognized the heavy cream paper and elaborate seal immediately. It was from the Countess of Pembroke, one of London society's most formidable hostesses and a woman whose approval could make or break social careers. The annual winter charity gala, Cordelia read aloud, examining the invitation with raised eyebrows. How interesting. Lady Pembroke rarely extends her reach beyond London's inner circle. Alexander studied the elegant script that cordially requested his presence at Bath's assembly rooms for an evening dedicated to raising funds for various charitable causes. The guest list, he knew, would include the cream of both London and Bath society, exactly the sort of gathering he had been avoiding since his arrival in the city. She's testing the waters, he realized, seeing if I'm ready to rejoin polite society and whether society is ready to receive me. And are you? Cordelia asked, her grey eyes studying him with characteristic directness. Ready, that is. Alexander considered the question seriously. 6 weeks in Bath had transformed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The daily walks, stimulating conversations and freedom from ducal obligations had restored something he hadn't realized he'd lost, a sense of himself as a man rather than merely a title. The prospect of returning to the elaborate social theatre of his former life held little appeal, but perhaps it was time to test whether he could navigate that world on his own terms. I believe I am, he said finally, though I suspect the evening will prove illuminating. What he didn't mention to his aunt was his hope that Miss Evelyn Sinclair might also attend. The Thornfield family moved in respectable circles, and Mrs. Thornfield's progressive views might well extend to supporting charitable causes. The possibility of seeing Evelyn again in a social setting both thrilled and terrified him. Over the past month, their acquaintance had deepened through a series of carefully orchestrated encounters. She had indeed attended one of Cordelia's gatherings, where her thoughtful contributions to discussions of social reform had impressed everyone present. Alexander had found excuses to visit the lending library when he knew she would be there, and they had taken several walks through Bath's elegant streets, their conversations ranging from literature to politics to philosophy. Each encounter had only strengthened his growing conviction that Evelyn Sinclair was unlike any woman he had ever known. She possessed a rare combination of intelligence, compassion, and independence that challenged everything he thought he knew about the opposite sex. More importantly, she seemed to see him, truly see him, in a way that no one else ever had. But their relationship remained carefully circumscribed by the realities of their different social positions. She was a governess, dependent on her employer's goodwill for her livelihood. He was a duke, whose every action was scrutinized by society. Any hint of impropriety could destroy her reputation and career, a responsibility that weighed heavily on his conscience. The evening of the gala arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if Bath itself was determined to provide the perfect backdrop for the season's most anticipated social event. Alexander dressed with unusual care, selecting a black evening coat that emphasized his tall frame and a white waistcoat that complemented his dark hair. His valet had insisted on a particularly elaborate arrangement of his cravat, and the result was a man who looked every inch the Duke, while somehow managing to appear more relaxed and confident than he had in years. The assembly rooms blazed with light as carriages deposited their elegantly dressed passengers at the entrance. Alexander arrived fashionably late, a calculated decision designed to minimize the initial stir his appearance would inevitably cause. Even so, conversations paused as he entered the ballroom, and he felt the familiar weight of dozens of eyes assessing his every move. The room had been transformed for the occasion, with elaborate floral arrangements and silk draperies, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance. A small orchestra played in one corner, while guests circulated among displays describing various charitable causes, orphanages, hospitals, schools for the poor. It was exactly the sort of worthy cause that allowed society to feel virtuous while enjoying an evening of entertainment. "Your Grace." Lady Pembroke materialized at his elbow with the speed of a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of social maneuvering. At 60, she remained formidable, her silver hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure that added inches to her already imposing height. "How delightful to see you looking so well. Bath air clearly agrees with you." "Lady Pembroke," Alexander replied with a bow that was respectful without being subservient. "Thank you for the invitation. The cause is certainly worthy." "Indeed it is. We've raised nearly £3,000 already this evening." Her sharp eyes studied his face with undisguised curiosity. "I trust you've found Bath restorative after your recent difficulties." The question was delicately phrased but unmistakably direct. Alexander recognized it as both a test and an opportunity. His response would be analyzed and reported throughout London society within days. "Bath has been exactly what I needed," he replied honestly. "Sometimes a change of perspective is the greatest gift one can receive." Lady Pembroke's eyebrows rose slightly at this philosophical response, but before she could probe further, they were interrupted by the arrival of another guest, whose presence sent a ripple of excitement through the assembled company. "Lord Sterling Thorne," Lady Pembroke announced with obvious satisfaction. "How wonderful that you could join us." Alexander turned to face the man he had once considered a friend, though their relationship had cooled considerably in recent years. Sterling was everything Alexander had once thought he should be. Impeccably dressed, supremely confident, and possessed of the kind of casual arrogance that came from never having his desires thwarted. At 32, he had inherited one of England's largest fortunes along with his title, and he wielded both with the careless authority of a man who had never known genuine hardship. "Alexander," Sterling said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "what a surprise to find you here. I thought you'd sworn off society gatherings after your memorable wedding day." The comment was delivered with just enough humor to seem friendly, but Alexander caught the underlying malice. Sterling had always possessed a talent for finding exactly the right words to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. "On the contrary," Alexander replied smoothly, "I've simply become more selective about which gatherings deserve my attention." "How wise," Sterling's smile sharpened. "Though I confess I'm surprised to see you at a charity event. I wouldn't have thought supporting the less fortunate was among your priorities." The insult was subtle, but unmistakable, an implication that Alexander was selfish and uncaring. It was exactly the sort of social maneuvering that had once left him feeling defensive and uncertain. But 6 weeks in Bath had changed him, and he found himself responding with a confidence he hadn't known he possessed. "Perhaps you don't know me as well as you think," Alexander said quietly. "I've discovered that genuine worth isn't always found in the places society expects." Before Sterling could respond, Alexander's attention was captured by a familiar figure across the room. Evelyn had just entered with the Thornfield family, and the sight of her took his breath away. She wore a gown of deep sapphire silk that complemented her auburn hair perfectly, the color bringing out the golden flecks in her brown eyes. The dress was elegant without being ostentatious, clearly expensive, but not showy. Exactly what one would expect from a governess attending a formal event with her employers, but it wasn't her appearance that captivated him, stunning though she was. It was the way she carried herself, with quiet dignity and confidence that needed no external validation. She moved through the room like someone comfortable in her own skin, neither intimidated by the grandeur around her, nor trying to impress anyone with false sophistication. "Ah," Sterling followed his gaze with obvious interest. "And who might that vision be? I don't believe I've had the pleasure." Alexander felt a surge of protective instinct that surprised him with its intensity. "Miss Sinclair is a governess with the Thornfield family, a woman of considerable intelligence and refinement." "A governess," Sterling repeated, his tone suggesting he found the information fascinating for reasons that had nothing to do with Evelyn's intellectual qualities. "How refreshing. Perhaps you could introduce us." Every instinct Alexander possessed screamed against the idea, but refusing would only draw more attention to his interest in Evelyn. With considerable reluctance, he led Sterling across the room, arriving just as the Thornfield family was greeting other acquaintances. Mrs. Thornfield, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and prematurely grey hair, welcomed Alexander warmly. "Your Grace, how lovely to see you again. I believe you've met our Miss Sinclair?" "Indeed," Alexander replied, bowing to Evelyn with perhaps more formality than their previous encounters warranted. "Miss Sinclair, may I present Lord Sterling Thorne? Sterling, Miss Evelyn Sinclair." Evelyn curtsied gracefully, but Alexander noticed the slight wariness in her eyes as she assessed Sterling. Her instincts, it seemed, were as sharp as her intellect. "Miss Sinclair," Sterling said, taking her gloved hand and holding it perhaps a moment longer than propriety demanded. "What a delightful surprise. Alexander tells me you're a governess. How fascinating. I've always believed that the education of young minds is among the most important work in society." The words were perfectly appropriate, but something in Sterling's tone made them sound condescending. Alexander watched Evelyn's expression carefully, noting the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she had caught the subtle insult. "How kind of you to say so, Lord Thorne," she replied with a smile that was polite but cool. "Though I suspect many in society would disagree with your assessment of a governess's importance." "Then they would be fools," Sterling replied smoothly. "Beauty and intelligence combined with noble purpose, a rare combination indeed." "La!" Alexander felt his jaw clench at the obvious flattery, but Evelyn seemed unimpressed by Sterling's charm offensive. If anything, she appeared to find his attention slightly tedious. "You're too kind," she said, then turned to Alexander with obvious relief. "Your Grace, I was hoping to speak with you about the book your aunt recommended. I found Wollstonecraft's arguments quite compelling, though I suspect not everyone would agree." "I'd be delighted to discuss it," Alexander replied, grateful for the opportunity to engage with her on intellectual grounds rather than social pleasantries. "Her views on education are particularly relevant to your work, I imagine." "Indeed. The idea that women's supposed intellectual inferiority stems from lack of opportunity rather than natural incapacity is revolutionary, even now." Sterling's eyebrows rose at this display of serious intellectual discussion. "How progressive," he said with a laugh that suggested he found their conversation amusing rather than impressive. "Though I confess I've always believed that a woman's greatest education comes from understanding her proper role in society." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Alexander felt his temper rise at the casual dismissal of everything Evelyn represented, but before he could respond, she spoke with a composure that was more devastating than any angry retort could have been. "How interesting that you should say so, Lord Thorne. I've found that understanding one's proper role requires first understanding oneself, something that's rather difficult to achieve without education, don't you think?" The response was perfectly polite, but utterly deflating. Sterling's confident smile faltered slightly as he realized he had been outmaneuvered by a governess who possessed more wit and intelligence than he had anticipated. "Quite right," he said, recovering his composure with visible effort, "though I suspect a woman of your qualities might find opportunities for advancement beyond the schoolroom, given the right circumstances." The implication was clear, and Alexander felt his hands clench into fists. Sterling was suggesting that Evelyn might improve her position through the patronage of a wealthy man, a proposition that was both insulting and dangerous. But Evelyn handled the situation with a grace that left Alexander in awe. "How thoughtful of you to be concerned about my future, Lord Thorne. Fortunately, I find great satisfaction in my current position. The Thornfield family values education and independent thinking, qualities that aren't always appreciated in other circumstances." The subtle rebuke was delivered with such elegance that Sterling couldn't take offense without appearing churlish. Alexander found himself admiring not just Evelyn's intelligence, but her remarkable social skills. She had managed to deflect Sterling's inappropriate suggestions while maintaining perfect propriety. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and couples began moving toward the dance floor. Sterling, apparently deciding to try a different approach, turned to Evelyn with his most charming smile. "Miss Sinclair, would you honor me with this dance?" Alexander held his breath, knowing that refusing would be difficult for Evelyn without appearing rude. But she handled the situation with characteristic aplomb. "How kind of you to ask, Lord Thorn, but I'm afraid I promised this dance to someone else." She turned to Alexander with a smile that was both grateful and mischievous. "Your Grace, I believe this is our waltz." Alexander had made no such arrangement, but he wasn't about to waste the opportunity she had created. "Of course," he said, offering his arm with a bow. "I was just about to claim my dance." As they moved onto the floor, Alexander was acutely aware of the attention their partnership was drawing. A duke dancing with a governess was unusual enough to generate considerable interest, but he found he didn't care. For the first time in months, he was exactly where he wanted to be. "Thank you," Evelyn said quietly as they took their positions. Lord Thorn seemed persistent. "Sterling has always had difficulty accepting that not everyone finds his attention welcome," Alexander replied, placing his hand at her waist with careful propriety. "You handled him masterfully. Years of managing difficult pupils have their advantages," she said with a smile that made his heart race. As the music began and they moved into the familiar patterns of the waltz, Alexander felt as if the rest of the world had faded away. Evelyn was a graceful dancer, following his lead with an ease that suggested natural ability rather than extensive training. Their conversation continued in low tones, ranging from the evening's charitable causes to observations about their fellow guests. "You seem different tonight," Evelyn observed as they turned through a particularly complex sequence. "More yourself, if that makes sense." "It makes perfect sense," Alexander replied, surprised by her perceptiveness. "I feel more myself than I have in years. Bath has been good for me, but I think the company has been even better." Their eyes met as he spoke, and Alexander saw something in her expression that made his pulse quicken. For a moment, the careful boundaries they had maintained seemed to waver, replaced by something deeper and more dangerous. But the moment was interrupted by the approach of another couple. Sterling, who had claimed a dance with one of the Thornfield daughters, and was now maneuvering to dance near them with obvious intent. "Alexander!" Sterling called out as their paths crossed. "You must tell me more about Miss Sinclair's educational philosophy. I find myself quite intrigued by her unconventional views." The comment was designed to sound innocent, but Alexander caught the underlying suggestion that Evelyn's ideas were somehow inappropriate or dangerous. It was exactly the sort of subtle social sabotage that Sterling excelled at, planting seeds of doubt while maintaining plausible deniability. "Miss Sinclair's views are both well-informed and thoughtfully expressed," Alexander replied firmly. "Anyone who takes the time to actually listen to her would find them quite reasonable." "Oh, I'm certain they are," Sterling said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Though I confess I sometimes wonder if such progressive ideas are entirely suitable for someone in her position. Employers can be quite particular about the influences their children are exposed to." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Sterling was suggesting that Evelyn's intellectual independence might jeopardize her employment. Alexander felt his temper flare at the casual cruelty of using a woman's economic vulnerability as a weapon. But before he could respond, Evelyn spoke with a composure that was more impressive than any angry retort could have been. "How fortunate that the Thornfield family values critical thinking and intellectual curiosity, Lord Thorn. They believe that children benefit from exposure to diverse ideas and perspectives, a philosophy that has served their family quite well." The response was perfectly calibrated to deflect Sterling's attack while subtly implying that families who didn't share such progressive views were somehow inferior. Sterling's smile tightened as he realized his gambit had failed. As the waltz concluded and they returned to the edge of the dance floor, Alexander found himself filled with admiration for Evelyn's grace under pressure. She had faced down one of society's most skilled manipulators without losing her composure or compromising her principles. "You were magnificent," he said quietly, as they walked toward the refreshment table. "I've had practice dealing with bullies," she replied with a slight smile, "though I confess Lord Thorn is more sophisticated than most. Sterling has always believed that his title and wealth give him the right to say whatever he pleases," Alexander said, his voice tight with anger. "I apologize for subjecting you to his attention." "You have nothing to apologize for," Evelyn assured him, "though I suspect this won't be the last we see of him this evening." She was right. Throughout the remainder of the gala, Sterling made several more attempts to engage Evelyn in conversation, each time with increasing boldness. He complimented her appearance, questioned her about her background, and made several thinly veiled suggestions about opportunities that might be available to a woman of her qualities. Each time, Evelyn deflected his advances with a skill that left Alexander both impressed and increasingly protective. But he could see the strain the constant vigilance was taking on her, the way her smile became more forced as the evening progressed. It was near midnight when Sterling made his most direct move. Alexander had been momentarily separated from Evelyn by the crowd when he saw Sterling corner her near the terrace doors, his body language suggesting a conversation that was far from casual. "Miss Sinclair," Sterling was saying as Alexander approached, "I hope you'll consider my offer carefully. A woman of your attributes shouldn't waste her talents in a schoolroom when so many other opportunities await." "I'm quite content with my current situation, Lord Thorn," Evelyn replied, but Alexander could hear the tension in her voice. "Content, perhaps, but surely not fulfilled," Sterling pressed, moving closer. "I could offer you a position in my household, as a companion to my elderly aunt, perhaps. The salary would be considerably more generous than what you're currently receiving, and the duties far less demanding." The offer was couched in respectable terms, but Alexander understood the real proposition being made. Sterling was offering to make Evelyn his mistress, disguised as employment that would give her social cover while keeping her available for his pleasure. "Lord Thorn," Alexander said, his voice carrying the full authority of his title and barely controlled anger, "I believe Miss Sinclair has made her position quite clear." Sterling turned with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Alexander, how good of you to join us. I was just discussing career opportunities with Miss Sinclair. Surely you agree that a woman of her talents deserves every chance for advancement." "I agree that Miss Sinclair is perfectly capable of making her own decisions about her future," Alexander replied, moving to stand beside Evelyn in a gesture of unmistakable support, "and that those decisions should be respected by everyone." The confrontation was drawing attention from other guests, and Alexander could see Sterling calculating whether to press his advantage or retreat. After a moment, he chose discretion, though his smile remained predatory. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I merely wanted to ensure that Miss Sinclair was aware of all her options. One never knows when circumstances might change." With that parting shot, he melted back into the crowd, leaving Alexander and Evelyn alone on the terrace. The cool night air was a relief after the heated atmosphere inside, and Alexander found himself breathing deeply as he tried to control his anger. "Are you all right?" he asked, turning to study Evelyn's face in the moonlight. "I'm fine," she replied, though he could see the slight tremor in her hands. "Though I confess Lord Thorn is more persistent than I anticipated." "Sterling is a predator," Alexander said bluntly. "He sees something he wants and assumes his wealth and title give him the right to take it. I should have warned you more explicitly." "I'm not as naive as you might think," Evelyn said with a slight smile. "I understood exactly what he was offering and why. The question is, what happens now?" Alexander knew what she meant. Sterling's interest in her was now public knowledge, and his pursuit would likely become more aggressive. Worse, his suggestions about her suitability as a governess could damage her reputation and jeopardize her position with the Thornfield family. "I won't let him hurt you," Alexander said, the words coming out with more intensity than he had intended. Evelyn looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "And how exactly would you prevent it? You're a duke, Alexander, but even you can't control what people say or think." The use of his given name sent a thrill through him, but her words forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. His feelings for Evelyn had grown far beyond mere friendship, but what could he offer her? His world was one of rigid social hierarchies and unforgiving expectations. Any relationship between them would be scandalous, potentially destroying both their reputations. But as he looked at her in the moonlight, her auburn hair gleaming and her brown eyes reflecting the stars above, Alexander realized that he was past caring about scandal or social expectations. For the first time in his life, he had found someone who saw him as a man rather than a title, someone whose mind and spirit matched his own. The question was whether he had the courage to risk everything for the chance at genuine happiness, and whether she would be willing to take that risk with him. What would it cost them both to choose love over security, and would the price be worth paying? The morning after the charity gala dawned grey and drizzling, as if the heavens themselves reflected the turmoil that had settled over Bath's polite society. By 10 o'clock, the drawing rooms of the Royal Crescent buzzed with whispered conversations about the Duke of Pemberton's obvious interest in a mere governess, and Lord Stirling Thorne's equally obvious pursuit of the same woman. The scandal-hungry matrons who had attended the previous evening's festivities found themselves with enough material to fuel months of speculation. Alexander sat in Cordelia's morning room, staring out at the rain-soaked streets, while his aunt read aloud from the various notes that had arrived with the early post. Each message was a masterpiece of polite inquiry, disguised as social concern, but their collective intent was unmistakable. Bath society wanted answers about the Duke's intentions regarding Miss Sinclair. "Lady Pembroke writes that she hopes you found the evening illuminating," Cordelia read with obvious amusement. "Mrs. Whitmore inquires whether you might be available for tea this afternoon, as she has matters of mutual interest to discuss. And the Dowager Countess of Ashford suggests that certain situations require careful consideration before they progress beyond the point of discretion." "In other words," Alexander said dryly, "they want to know if I've completely taken leave of my senses." "Have you?" Cordelia asked, setting down the letters and studying her nephew with shrewd eyes. "Taken leave of your senses, that is?" Alexander considered the question seriously. By any rational measure, his growing feelings for Evelyn Sinclair were indeed a form of madness. She was a governess with no fortune, no family connections, and no social standing. A relationship between them would create exactly the sort of scandal that could destroy careers and reputations. Yet as he thought of her grace under Stirling's pressure, her intelligence and wit, the way she had looked at him in the moonlight, he found he didn't care about rational measures. "Perhaps I have," he admitted, "but if so, it's the first time in my life that madness has felt like sanity." Cordelia smiled at this response, her expression mixing approval with concern. "I've grown quite fond of Miss Sinclair myself. She's a remarkable young woman, intelligent, principled, and possessed of a strength that many titled ladies would envy. But you must understand the position you're placing her in." "What do you mean?" "Your attention, however well-intentioned, makes her vulnerable. Stirling Thorne's pursuit becomes more dangerous when it's seen as competition with a duke. Other men may view her as fair game if they believe you're merely amusing yourself. And her employers, however progressive, may find the situation complicated." The truth of Cordelia's words hit Alexander like a physical blow. In his growing infatuation with Evelyn, he had focused on his own feelings without fully considering the consequences for her. A governess who became the subject of romantic speculation, particularly involving men of high rank, could find herself unemployable regardless of her qualifications or character. "Then what would you suggest?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "That depends entirely on your intentions," Cordelia replied. "If this is merely a passing fancy, then you should withdraw immediately and allow the gossip to die down. But if your feelings are serious, if you're considering a future with Miss Sinclair, then you need to act decisively before others make that choice for you." Before Alexander could respond, Stevens appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely concealed excitement. "Your Grace, Lord Sterling Thorne has called. He's waiting in the drawing room." Alexander exchanged a glance with his aunt, both understanding that Sterling's visit was no social courtesy. The man had come to stake his claim or issue a challenge, and either possibility promised complications. "Show him in," Alexander said, rising to his feet. "And Stevens, please ensure we're not disturbed." Sterling entered with his usual confident swagger, though Alexander noticed a tension around his eyes that suggested the previous evening's encounters had affected him more than he cared to admit. He was impeccably dressed in a morning coat of dark blue wool, his cravat arranged with mathematical precision, every detail calculated to project wealth and authority. "Alexander," he said with a smile that held no warmth, "and Lady Cordelia, how delightful. I hope I'm not intruding on family time." "Not at all," Cordelia replied, with the kind of polite coolness that could freeze champagne, "though I suspect your visit has a specific purpose." "Indeed it does," Sterling said, settling into a chair without waiting for an invitation. "I wanted to discuss last evening's entertainment, particularly your charming Miss Sinclair." "Miss Sinclair is not mine in any sense," Alexander replied carefully. "She's an independent woman who makes her own choices." "How refreshingly modern of you," Sterling said with a laugh that grated on Alexander's nerves. "Though I confess, I'm surprised by your interest in a woman so far beneath your station. Surely a duke can aim higher than a governess, however attractive she might be." The casual dismissal of Evelyn's worth based solely on her social position ignited Alexander's temper, but he forced himself to remain calm. Sterling was baiting him, looking for a reaction that could be used against him later. "I found that true worth isn't always reflected in social position," Alexander said evenly. "Miss Sinclair possesses qualities that many titled ladies lack: intelligence, integrity, genuine accomplishment." "Oh, I don't dispute her qualities," Sterling replied, with a leer that made Alexander's hands clench into fists. "In fact, I find myself quite taken with her, which brings me to the purpose of my visit." He leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "I'm prepared to make Miss Sinclair a very generous offer, a position in my household that would provide her with security, comfort, and protection. Surely you can see that such an arrangement would benefit everyone involved." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the true nature of Sterling's proposition. He was offering to make Evelyn his mistress, couching the arrangement in terms of employment to give it a veneer of respectability. "I'm certain Miss Sinclair would find your offer as insulting as I do," Alexander said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Insulting?" Sterling's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "I'm offering her a chance to improve her circumstances considerably. What could be insulting about that?" "The assumption that she would trade her honor for material comfort," Cordelia interjected, her voice carrying the full authority of her years and position. "Miss Sinclair is a lady, Lord Thorne, regardless of her current employment." Sterling's mask of civility slipped slightly, revealing the calculating predator beneath. "Come now, Lady Cordelia, we're all adults here. A woman in Miss Sinclair's position has limited options. She can spend her life teaching other people's children for a pittance, or she can accept the protection of a man who can provide for her properly. And what makes you think she would choose you as that protector?" Alexander asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Because I'm offering her something you cannot," Sterling replied with renewed confidence. "Security without scandal. My proposition, while unconventional, can be arranged discreetly. Yours, on the other hand." He shrugged eloquently. "A duke cannot marry a governess without creating exactly the sort of scandal that would destroy both your reputations." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Sterling had identified the central problem that Alexander had been trying to ignore, the impossibility of any honorable relationship between them, given their different social positions. "Unless, of course," Sterling continued with a smile that was pure malice, "you're not considering marriage at all, in which case my offer becomes even more reasonable. Why should she accept a temporary liaison with a duke when she could have a permanent arrangement with a man who won't abandon her when society pressure becomes too great?" Alexander felt his control slipping as Sterling's words painted a picture of cynical calculation that reduced Evelyn to a commodity to be bargained over. But before he could respond, Cordelia spoke with the authority that commanded attention. "Lord Thorne," she said, rising to her feet with regal dignity, "I believe this conversation has reached its natural conclusion. Miss Sinclair is perfectly capable of making her own decisions about her future, and I doubt she requires input from either of you regarding her choices." Sterling stood as well, though his expression suggested he wasn't finished with the conversation. "Of course, Lady Cordelia, though I hope Alexander will consider the practical realities of the situation. Miss Sinclair deserves better than to become the subject of scandal and speculation." With that parting shot, he took his leave, but not before turning back to Alexander with a final warning. "I meant what I said about my offer, Alexander. Miss Sinclair would be wise to consider it carefully. Opportunities for advancement don't come along often for women in her position." After Sterling's departure, the morning room fell into heavy silence. Alexander stood at the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, while his mind churned with the implications of the conversation. Sterling had forced him to confront the central dilemma of his feelings for Evelyn. How could he pursue a relationship that would inevitably damage her reputation and prospects? "He's not entirely wrong, you know," Cordelia said quietly. "About the practical difficulties, I mean. A marriage between you and Miss Sinclair would create enormous challenges." "But not impossible ones," Alexander replied, turning to face his aunt. "People have married across social lines before." "Yes, and most have lived to regret it. The social isolation, the constant whispers, the way their children are treated. It takes a very special kind of love to survive such pressures." Alexander considered this soberly. Was his feeling for Evelyn strong enough to withstand the storms that would inevitably follow? More importantly, was it fair to ask her to endure such difficulties for his sake? "There is another consideration," Cordelia continued. "Miss Sinclair herself. Have you given any thought to what she might want? She's built a life based on independence and self-respect. Marriage to you would end that independence, regardless of how much you might try to preserve it." The observation struck Alexander with unexpected force. In all his agonizing over the social obstacles to their relationship, he had assumed that Evelyn would welcome his attention if he could find a way to make it respectable. But what if she valued her freedom more than the security he could offer? What if the very independence that attracted him to her made her reluctant to surrender her autonomy to any man, regardless of his rank or intentions? These troubling thoughts were interrupted by Stephen's return, this time bearing a note that had just been delivered by hand. Alexander recognized the neat handwriting immediately. It was from Evelyn. "Your Grace," the note read, "I would be grateful for the opportunity to speak with you privately regarding recent events. If convenient, I will be walking in Sydney Gardens at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Most respectfully, E. Sinclair." Alexander checked his pocket watch. It was nearly 2 o'clock. Whatever Evelyn wanted to discuss, she clearly considered it urgent enough to risk the impropriety of requesting a private meeting. "I must go," he told Cordelia, who had been watching his face as he read. "Alexander," she called as he reached the door, "whatever she has to say, listen with your heart as well as your head, and remember, sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let someone go." Sydney Gardens in winter possessed a melancholy beauty that seemed appropriate to Alexander's mood as he made his way along the gravel paths. The formal plantings had been reduced to bare branches and dormant flower beds, while the classical pavilions and bridges stood like monuments to more cheerful seasons. A few hardy souls braved the damp air for their constitutional, but most of Bath's residents had chosen to remain indoors. He found Evelyn near the labyrinth, standing beneath a bare oak tree with her hands clasped before her. She wore a practical walking dress of dark brown wool and a matching pelisse that emphasized her slender figure. Her auburn hair was partially hidden beneath a small hat, but he could see the tension in her posture even from a distance. "Miss Sinclair?" he said as he approached, offering a formal bow that seemed absurd given their previous intimacy of conversation. "Your Grace," she replied with an equally formal curtsy. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't certain you would receive my note in time. I came as soon as I could. Your message suggested some urgency." Evelyn glanced around to ensure they were alone, then began walking slowly along the path. Alexander fell into step beside her, acutely aware of the impropriety of their meeting, while simultaneously grateful for the opportunity to speak with her privately. "I wanted to discuss last evening," she said without preamble. "Specifically, the attention I received from Lord Thorn and the speculation it seems to have generated." "I'm sorry you were subjected to Sterling's pursuit," Alexander said. "His behavior was inexcusable." "Lord Thorn's behavior is his own responsibility," Evelyn replied with characteristic directness. "What concerns me more is the position I find myself in as a result of recent events." Alexander felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. "What do you mean?" Evelyn stopped walking and turned to face him, her brown eyes serious and determined. "I mean that I've become the subject of gossip and speculation that could damage not only my own reputation, but that of the Thornfield family. Mrs. Thornfield has been nothing but kind to me, and I won't repay that kindness by bringing scandal to her household." "Surely the situation isn't that serious," Alexander protested, though he feared it was. "Isn't it?" Evelyn's smile was sad but resolute. "This morning I received 3 separate visits from ladies eager to warn me about the dangers of attracting attention from men above my station. Mrs. Thornfield has been fielding inquiries about my character and suitability as a governess, and Lord Thorn has sent no fewer than 2 notes requesting the pleasure of my company for various social engagements." The picture she painted was even worse than Alexander had feared. Evelyn was being subjected to exactly the sort of scrutiny and pressure that could destroy her carefully built life. "What are you saying?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "I'm saying that I've decided to accept a position elsewhere," Evelyn replied quietly. "Mrs. Thornfield has a sister in Edinburgh who requires a governess for her daughters. The position would allow me to start fresh, away from the complications that have arisen here." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. The thought of Evelyn leaving Bath, leaving him, filled him with a desperation he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. "You can't leave," he said, the words coming out more forcefully than he had intended. "Not because of gossip and speculation, not because of Sterling's unwanted attention." "Can't I?" Evelyn's voice was gentle but firm. "Alexander, I've worked too hard to build my independence to see it destroyed by circumstances beyond my control. In Edinburgh, I can be simply Miss Sinclair, governess, without the complications of dukes and lords and society gossip." "But what about what you want?" Alexander asked desperately. "What about your own feelings in all this?" For a moment, Evelyn's composed facade cracked, revealing something vulnerable and uncertain beneath. "My feelings are irrelevant," she said quietly. "I'm a governess, Alexander. I can't afford the luxury of feelings that lead nowhere." "But what if they could lead somewhere?" The words were out before Alexander could stop them, carrying with them implications that changed everything between them. Evelyn stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to read his intentions. "What are you saying?" Alexander took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would irrevocably alter both their lives. I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, Evelyn. Completely, desperately, irrevocably in love. And I'm asking you to marry me." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Evelyn's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, something that might have been joy, and finally, heartbreaking sadness. "Alexander," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "you can't possibly mean that." "I've never meant anything more in my life," he replied, stepping closer to her. "I know the obstacles seem insurmountable. I know society will be scandalized, but I don't care. I'd rather face a lifetime of social disapproval with you than a lifetime of empty respectability without you." Tears began to gather in Evelyn's eyes, and for a moment Alexander thought she might accept. But then she shook her head, stepping back from him with visible effort. "You say you don't care about society's disapproval, but you should," she said. "You're a duke, Alexander. You have responsibilities, obligations, a legacy to preserve. You can't throw all of that away for a governess." "I'm not throwing anything away," Alexander protested. "I'm choosing to build something real instead of maintaining something hollow." "And what about me?" Evelyn asked, her voice breaking slightly. "What about my choices, my independence, my sense of self-worth? If I marry you, I become the governess who court a duke, forever defined by what I managed to achieve rather than who I am. Every kindness you show me will be seen as charity. Every accomplishment I make will be attributed to your influence." The pain in her voice was almost unbearable, but Alexander pressed on. "It doesn't have to be that way. We could make our own rules, create our own life." "Could we?" Evelyn smiled sadly. "You're a good man, Alexander, perhaps the best I've ever known, but you've lived your entire life in a world of privilege and position. You can't simply step outside that world because you've fallen in love, and I can't step into it without losing everything that makes me who I am." Alexander felt his heart breaking as he realized the truth in her words. In his desperation to keep her, he had offered her a future that would require her to sacrifice the very qualities that had made him love her in the first place. "So you're leaving," he said, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "I'm leaving," she confirmed. "Not because I don't care for you, I do more than I should, more than is wise, but because sometimes caring for someone means making the difficult choice, even when it breaks your heart." They stood in silence for several minutes, the weight of unspoken words and impossible dreams hanging between them. Finally, Evelyn reached into her reticule and withdrew a small, wrapped package. "I wanted to return this," she said, offering him the volume of Wollstonecraft that Cordelia had lent her. "Please give Lady Cordelia my thanks for her kindness." Alexander took the book, his fingers brushing hers for what he knew would be the last time. "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow morning. Mrs. Thornfield has arranged for me to travel with a family friend who is journeying to Edinburgh on business." "So soon." "It's better this way," Evelyn said, though her voice suggested she found no comfort in the necessity. Prolonging the situation would only make things more difficult for everyone involved. As they walked back toward the garden's entrance, Alexander found himself memorizing every detail of her appearance, every inflection of her voice, knowing that these moments would have to sustain him through whatever came next. "Evelyn," he said, as they reached the point where their paths would diverge. "If circumstances were different, if we had met as equals without the complications of rank and society, do you think—" "Yes," she said simply, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "In another life, in another world, I think we could have been very happy together." With that admission hanging between them like a benediction and a curse, she turned and walked away, her figure growing smaller until she disappeared entirely among the winter-bare trees. Alexander stood alone in the gathering dusk, clutching the book she had returned and feeling as if his heart had been torn from his chest. For the first time in his life, he had found something worth fighting for, only to discover that the greatest act of love was letting it go. But as he made his way back to the Royal Crescent, a new determination began to take shape in his mind. Evelyn was right about the impossibility of their situation as it currently stood. But what if the situation could be changed? What if there was a way to bridge the gap between their worlds without requiring either of them to sacrifice their essential selves? The idea was audacious, perhaps even foolish, but as Alexander climbed the steps to Cordelia's house, he found himself wondering what would happen if a duke chose to redefine what it meant to be noble. 6 months had passed since that grey December morning when Evelyn Sinclair boarded the Edinburgh coach, leaving behind the honey-coloured stones of Bath and the man who had offered her everything she thought she wanted but couldn't accept. Spring had given way to summer, and now the Scottish capital basked in the golden light of early September, its ancient castle standing sentinel over a city that hummed with intellectual energy and progressive ideals. Evelyn stood at the window of the elegant townhouse on Charlotte Square, watching her charges, Miss Catherine and Miss Margaret Blackwood, aged 14 and 12 respectively, practice their archery in the garden below. The Blackwood family had proven to be everything Mrs. Thornfield had promised, enlightened, supportive, and genuinely committed to providing their daughters with an education that would prepare them for whatever future they might choose. Dr. James Blackwood was a prominent physician and medical researcher whose work on public health had earned him recognition throughout Europe. His wife, Eleanor, was a published author whose novels explored themes of social justice and women's rights. Their household was a haven for progressive thinkers, where dinner conversations ranged from the latest scientific discoveries to debates about political reform. In this environment, Evelyn had flourished. Her duties extended far beyond traditional governess work. She accompanied the family to lectures at the University of Edinburgh, helped Eleanor with her research, and even contributed articles to a progressive women's magazine under a carefully chosen pseudonym. For the first time in her adult life, she felt truly valued for her intellect and capabilities rather than merely tolerated as a necessary employee. Yet despite her professional satisfaction and the genuine affection she had developed for the Blackwood family, Evelyn found herself thinking often of Bath, of Lady Cordelia's stimulating salons, and most of all, of Alexander. She had received no word from him since her departure, a silence that was both expected and heartbreaking. Whatever feelings had existed between them belonged to a different life, one that circumstances had made impossible to pursue. "Miss Sinclair," called Catherine from the garden, her voice carrying the confidence that came from being raised to believe her opinions mattered. "Margaret insists that archery is merely a frivolous accomplishment, but I maintain it develops both physical coordination and mental discipline. What do you think?" Evelyn smiled as she opened the window to respond. The Blackwood sisters were delightfully argumentative, having been encouraged from birth to think critically and express their views. "I think you're both correct," she called back. "Archery can be frivolous if pursued merely as a social grace, but it becomes valuable when approached as a discipline that develops focus and precision." "See?" Catherine said triumphantly to her younger sister. "Miss Sinclair understands the importance of practical skills." "But she also said you were being frivolous," Margaret pointed out, with the logical precision that would serve her well in whatever career she eventually chose. "Which means I was also correct." Evelyn was still smiling at this exchange when Mrs. Blackwood appeared in the doorway of the morning room, holding a letter that bore the unmistakable seal of the Royal Mail. "This arrived for you, my dear," Eleanor said, her expression curious. "From Bath, by the look of it." Evelyn's heart skipped as she recognized Lady Cordelia's distinctive handwriting. In the months since her departure, she had exchanged several letters with Alexander's aunt, carefully neutral communications that focused on books, ideas, and mutual acquaintances, while scrupulously avoiding any mention of the Duke himself. "Thank you," Evelyn said, accepting the letter with hands that trembled slightly. "Lady Cordelia has been kind enough to keep me informed about developments in Bath society." Eleanor's knowing smile suggested she understood there was more to the correspondence than mere social updates, but she withdrew tactfully, leaving Evelyn alone to read whatever news the letter contained. With nervous fingers, Evelyn broke the seal and unfolded the heavy paper, immediately noticing that this letter was longer than Cordelia's usual communications. As she began to read, her eyes widened with each paragraph. "My dear Evelyn," the letter began, "I hope this finds you well and thriving in Edinburgh. Your last letter suggested that you have found both professional satisfaction and personal contentment with the Blackwood family, which brings me great joy. I write today with news that I believe will interest you, though I confess I am uncertain how you will receive it. Alexander has undergone what I can only describe as a complete transformation since your departure. The change began gradually, but has accelerated dramatically in recent months, culminating in decisions that have shocked Bath society and sent ripples throughout the highest circles of English aristocracy. Shortly after you left, my nephew began what he called a systematic examination of his responsibilities and privileges. He spent weeks in consultation with lawyers, accountants, and social reformers, developing what he termed a new model of noble obligation. The results of these deliberations became apparent in March, when he announced his intention to establish a series of educational institutions for working-class children, funded entirely from his personal fortune. But this was merely the beginning. In April, he shocked society by opening Pemberton Manor to a group of progressive educators and social reformers, transforming his ancestral home into what he calls a centre for practical philanthropy. The estate now houses a school for the children of agricultural workers, a training college for aspiring teachers, and a research institute dedicated to improving conditions for the working poor. The reaction from London society has been explosive. Alexander has been denounced as a radical, a traitor to his class, and worse. Several prominent families have cut all social ties with him, and there has been talk of pressuring the Crown to review his ducal privileges. Through it all, he has remained serenely indifferent to the criticism, focusing entirely on his work. But perhaps the most remarkable change has been in Alexander himself. Gone is the dutiful, somewhat melancholy man who felt trapped by his circumstances. In his place is someone who radiates purpose and genuine happiness. He has found his calling, my dear, and it has transformed him completely. I tell you this not to reopen old wounds, but because I believe you deserve to know that your influence on his life has been profound and lasting. The conversations you shared, the ideas you introduced him to, the example of your own independence and integrity, all of these have shaped the man he has become. There is more, however, and this is where I must tread carefully. Last week, Alexander received an invitation that has created quite a stir. The University of Edinburgh has offered him an honorary doctorate in recognition of his educational philanthropy, to be awarded at a special ceremony in October. More significantly, they have invited him to deliver a lecture on the social responsibilities of privilege as part of their autumn series on progressive reform. Alexander has accepted both honours, which means he will be travelling to Edinburgh next month. I thought you should know in case you wish to. Prepare yourself for the possibility of an encounter. I remain, as always, your devoted friend and admirer. Whatever the future holds, please know that you have my deepest affection and respect. Most fondly, Cordelia. Evelyn read the letter twice, then a third time, her emotions cycling through surprise, admiration, and a complex mixture of joy and apprehension. The picture Cordelia painted of Alexander's transformation was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Inspiring because he had found a way to use his position for genuine good. Heartbreaking because it suggested the man she had fallen in love with had been capable of exactly the kind of meaningful change she had believed impossible. The knowledge that he would be coming to Edinburgh filled her with conflicting emotions. Part of her longed to see him again, to witness firsthand the transformation Cordelia described, but another part feared that such a meeting would reopen wounds that had only recently begun to heal. "Miss Sinclair?" Catherine's voice from the garden interrupted her reverie. "Are you quite well? You look rather pale." Evelyn realized she had been standing motionless at the window for several minutes, the letter clutched in her hands. "I'm fine, dear," she called back. "Just some unexpected news from Bath." But as she folded the letter and placed it carefully in her writing desk, Evelyn knew that fine was the last thing she was. Alexander's impending arrival in Edinburgh would force her to confront feelings she had worked hard to suppress and decisions she had thought were settled forever. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of anticipation and anxiety. Evelyn threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, helping Catherine prepare for her entrance examinations to the University of Edinburgh's new women's programme, and assisting Margaret with an ambitious project on Scottish history. The Blackwood family, sensing her distraction but too polite to pry, provided gentle support while respecting her privacy. It was Dr. Blackwood who first mentioned the upcoming university ceremony during one of their regular dinner conversations about academic and social developments. "The university has quite a coup this autumn," he announced over the soup course. "The Duke of Pemberton will be receiving an honorary doctorate and delivering a lecture on social responsibility. From what I hear, his work in educational reform has been quite remarkable." Eleanor looked up with interest. "The Duke of Pemberton? Isn't he the one who caused such a scandal by transforming his estate into a school?" "The very same," Dr. Blackwood confirmed, "though from what my colleagues tell me, the scandal has only enhanced his reputation in academic circles. His approach to philanthropy is refreshingly practical, less about charity and more about systemic change." "Will you attend the ceremony, Papa?" Catherine asked. "I should very much like to hear what a duke has to say about social responsibility." "Indeed I will," Dr. Blackwood replied, "and I believe the lecture is open to the public, so you may attend if you wish. What do you think, Miss Sinclair? Would you be interested in hearing the Duke's perspective on these matters?" Evelyn felt all eyes turned to her, and she struggled to keep her voice steady as she replied, "It sounds quite interesting. I'm sure His Grace will have valuable insights to share." The casual nature of her response seemed to satisfy the family's curiosity, but Evelyn spent the rest of the evening in a state of barely controlled agitation. The prospect of seeing Alexander again, of hearing him speak about the work that had apparently transformed his life, filled her with a mixture of excitement and dread that made sleep impossible. As October approached, Edinburgh began to buzz with anticipation for the university's autumn ceremonies. The Duke of Pemberton's visit had attracted attention far beyond academic circles. His reputation as an aristocratic radical had made him a figure of considerable public interest. Newspapers speculated about his motives, society matrons debated the propriety of his reforms, and progressive thinkers hailed him as a visionary. Through it all, Evelyn maintained her composure, but she found herself paying closer attention to every mention of the Duke in the papers, every snippet of conversation about his work. The picture that emerged was of a man who had indeed undergone a remarkable transformation, using his wealth and position to create genuine opportunities for those society typically ignored. The day of the ceremony dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant autumn light that made Edinburgh's ancient stones glow like amber. Evelyn had debated whether to attend until the very last moment, but curiosity and something deeper had ultimately won out. She dressed carefully in her best day dress, a deep green silk that brought out the golden flecks in her brown eyes, and accompanied the Blackwood family to the university's magnificent McEwen Hall. The hall was packed with academics, dignitaries, and members of the public drawn by curiosity about the controversial Duke. Evelyn found herself seated in the gallery with an excellent view of the platform where the ceremony would take place. As the academic procession began, her heart began to race with anticipation, and then she saw him. Alexander walked in the procession with quiet dignity, wearing the formal robes of an honorary doctorate over his dark suit. But it was the change in his bearing that struck her most forcefully. Gone was the subtle tension she remembered, the sense of a man constrained by circumstances beyond his control. In its place was a confidence that seemed to radiate from within, the bearing of someone who had found his true purpose. When he was introduced to deliver his lecture, the applause was enthusiastic and sustained. Alexander approached the podium with calm assurance, his grey eyes scanning the audience with genuine warmth. For a moment, Evelyn thought his gaze lingered on her section of the gallery, but from such a distance she couldn't be certain. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "I stand before you today not as a representative of aristocratic privilege, but as someone who has learned that true nobility lies not in what we inherit, but in what we choose to do with our inheritance." What followed was perhaps the most compelling speech Evelyn had ever heard. Alexander spoke with passion and eloquence about the responsibilities that came with privilege, the moral imperative to use wealth and position for the betterment of society. He described his educational initiatives not as charity, but as investments in human potential that benefited everyone. "We live in an age of unprecedented change," he continued, "where old certainties are being challenged and new possibilities are emerging. The question facing those of us born to privilege is simple. Will we use our advantages to preserve an unjust status quo, or will we help build a more equitable future?" He spoke about the children at his schools, their eagerness to learn and their potential to contribute to society if given proper opportunities. He discussed the teachers he had trained, many of them women who had been denied access to higher education but possessed remarkable gifts for instruction. Most movingly, he talked about the transformation in his own understanding of what it meant to lead a meaningful life. "I was once told by a very wise person," Alexander said, his voice taking on a more personal tone, "that true freedom comes not from the absence of responsibility, but from choosing responsibilities that align with our deepest values. That insight changed my life, and I hope it might inspire others to examine their own choices and possibilities." Udil, as he spoke these words, his eyes found Evelyn's across the crowded hall. For a moment that seemed to last forever, they looked at each other across the distance that separated them, and she saw in his expression a mixture of love, gratitude, and something that might have been hope. The speech concluded to thunderous applause, and the ceremony proceeded with the formal conferring of the honorary degree. But Evelyn barely registered the remaining proceedings, her mind reeling from the implications of what she had witnessed. The man on that platform was indeed transformed, but not in the way she had expected. Rather than abandoning his position, he had redefined it. Rather than rejecting his privilege, he had found a way to use it meaningfully. He had become the kind of leader she had always believed was possible, but had never seen in practice. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Evelyn found herself torn between the desire to flee and the need to somehow acknowledge what she had witnessed. The decision was made for her when Dr. Blackwood announced his intention to attend the reception that would follow. "The university has arranged a small gathering for distinguished guests," he explained to his family. "I believe it would be educational for the girls to meet some of the speakers and academics who will be present." Before Evelyn could excuse herself, Eleanor had linked arms with her. "You must come too, my dear. I'm particularly interested in meeting this remarkable Duke and hearing more about his educational philosophy." And so, Evelyn found herself in the university's elegant reception hall, surrounded by the intellectual elite of Edinburgh society, knowing that at any moment she might come face to face with the man who had haunted her thoughts for 6 months. The moment came sooner than expected. She was standing near a window, listening to Catherine engage a professor in animated discussion about women's education, when she felt a familiar presence behind her. Miss Sinclair. She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs, to find Alexander standing just a few feet away. He looked exactly as she remembered, yet completely different. The same handsome features and storm-grey eyes, but with a vitality and purpose that transformed his entire presence. "Your Grace," she replied, offering a curtsy that felt absurdly formal given their history. "Please," he said quietly, "just Alexander. I think we've moved beyond such formalities, don't you?" For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of 6 months of separation and unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. "You look well," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that made her pulse quicken. "Edinburgh clearly agrees with you." "As your work clearly agrees with you," Evelyn replied, finding her voice at last. "Your speech was extraordinary. The transformation you've achieved is remarkable." Alexander's smile was both grateful and slightly rueful. "The transformation was necessary. I discovered that I couldn't live with myself if I continued to waste the opportunities I'd been given." "And you've found happiness in this new path?" "I found purpose," Alexander replied carefully, "which is perhaps more important than happiness, though the two aren't mutually exclusive." Before Evelyn could respond, Dr. Blackwood appeared at her elbow, his face bright with enthusiasm. "Your Grace," he said, extending his hand to Alexander, "Dr. James Blackwood, I wanted to express my admiration for your work in educational reform. Your approach to systematic change is exactly what's needed." "Dr. Blackwood," Alexander replied, shaking the offered hand warmly, "I'm familiar with your research on public health. Your work on sanitation in working-class neighborhoods has been invaluable to my own efforts." As the two men began discussing their respective projects, Evelyn found herself studying Alexander's face, noting the genuine engagement and enthusiasm he displayed when talking about his work. This was a man who had found his calling, and the knowledge filled her with a complex mixture of admiration and regret. "Miss Sinclair has been invaluable to our family," Dr. Blackwood was saying. "Her insights into educational theory have influenced our own approach to our daughter's schooling." "Miss Sinclair has always possessed remarkable insights," Alexander replied, his eyes meeting hers briefly. "I'm not surprised to hear that she's making such valuable contributions." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Eleanor and the girls joining the group and adding their own perspectives on education and social reform. Throughout it all, Evelyn was acutely aware of Alexander's presence, the way he listened intently to every speaker, the genuine respect he showed for ideas regardless of their source. When the Blackwood family finally moved on to speak with other guests, Alexander and Evelyn found themselves alone for the first time since that painful afternoon in Sydney Gardens. "Walk with me," Alexander asked quietly, gesturing toward a quieter corner of the reception hall. Evelyn nodded, not trusting her voice, and they moved away from the crowd to a spot near a large window overlooking the university's courtyard. "I need to thank you," Alexander said without preamble. "Thank me? For what?" "For showing me what it meant to live with integrity, for demonstrating that true worth comes from what we do, not what we inherit, for having the courage to walk away when staying would have compromised everything you believed in." Evelyn felt tears prick at her eyes. "Alexander." "No, please let me finish," he said gently. "When you left Bath, I was devastated, but I was also forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself and my life. You were right when you said I couldn't simply step outside my world, but you were wrong about one thing." "What was that?" "You said I couldn't change that world, but I could, and I have. Not by abandoning my position, but by using it differently. By proving that privilege can be a tool for justice rather than an instrument of oppression." Evelyn looked at him with wonder, seeing not just the man she had fallen in love with, but someone who had grown beyond even her highest expectations of what he might become. "The work you're doing is extraordinary," she said softly. "You found a way to bridge the gap between idealism and practical action." "I've found a way to live with myself," Alexander corrected, "and to honor the example you set for me." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the late afternoon light slant across the courtyard. Finally, Alexander spoke again, his voice carefully neutral. "Dr. Blackwood mentioned that you've been writing articles for progressive publications," he said. Evelyn nodded. "Under a pseudonym, of course. The Blackwoods have been very supportive of my intellectual pursuits. I'm glad. Your ideas deserve a wider audience." He paused, then added, "I've read some of your work, actually. Your piece on women's education in the Edinburgh Review was particularly insightful." "You read the Edinburgh Review?" Evelyn asked, surprised. "I read everything now," Alexander replied with a slight smile. "Part of my education in becoming useful rather than merely ornamental. Your arguments about the economic benefits of educating women have influenced some of my own policy decisions." The knowledge that her work had reached him, had influenced his thinking, filled Evelyn with a warmth she hadn't expected. Despite the distance between them, despite the impossibility of their personal situation, they were still connected through their shared commitment to meaningful change. "Alexander," she said impulsively, "I want you to know how proud I am of what you've accomplished. You've become the kind of leader I always hoped was possible, but never thought I'd see." "Oh, no, and you've become exactly what I always knew you could be," he replied, "an independent woman making her own mark on the world." The words hung between them, carrying layers of meaning that neither dared to explore fully. They had both found their paths, both achieved the kind of meaningful lives they had dreamed of. But those paths had led them in different directions, and the gulf between their worlds remained as wide as ever. "I should return to the Blackwoods," Evelyn said finally, though every fibre of her being wanted to stay in this moment forever. "Of course," Alexander replied, though his eyes suggested he felt the same reluctance. "It was wonderful to see you again, Evelyn, to know that you're thriving." "And you," she said softly. "Take care of yourself, Alexander. The world needs more leaders like you." As she turned to go, Alexander's voice stopped her. "Evelyn, if circumstances were different, if we lived in a world where a duke and a governess could meet as equals, do you think we might have found a way to build something together?" She turned back to face him, her heart breaking and soaring simultaneously. "In that world," she said quietly, "I think we could have changed everything." With that admission hanging between them like a promise and a farewell, Evelyn walked away, rejoining the Blackwood family as they prepared to leave the reception. As their carriage rolled through Edinburgh's ancient streets, she gazed out at the city that had become her home, thinking about the extraordinary man she had just encountered and the impossible love that continued to shape both their lives. Alexander had found his calling, and she had found hers. They were both exactly where they needed to be, doing work that mattered, making a difference in the world. It should have been enough. But as Evelyn lay in her bed that night, staring at the ceiling and remembering the look in Alexander's eyes when he spoke of the world they might have shared, she couldn't help but wonder, was it possible that sometimes the greatest love stories were the ones that inspired people to become their best selves, even if they couldn't be together? And in the quiet darkness of her room, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, in some small way, their impossible love had indeed changed. Everything, not by bringing them together, but by making them both into the people the world needed them to be. The next morning brought news that would test that belief in ways she never could have imagined. The morning after the university reception dawned with an unexpected delivery that would alter the course of both their lives forever. Evelyn was taking breakfast with the Blackwood family when Stevens, their butler, announced that a messenger had arrived with an urgent communication for Miss Sinclair. The letter bore the official seal of the University of Edinburgh, and as Evelyn broke it open with trembling fingers, she could never have anticipated the words that would leap from the page to transform her understanding of what was possible. Miss E. Sinclair, the letter began, the University of Edinburgh is pleased to offer you the position of Director of Women's Educational Advancement, a newly established role created through the generous endowment of an anonymous benefactor. This position would involve developing curricula for our expanding women's programs, training female instructors, and conducting research into educational methodologies. The salary and benefits are commensurate with senior academic positions, and the role includes a residence on university grounds. We hope you will consider this opportunity to advance the cause of women's education at the highest levels of academic institution. Dr. Blackwood, reading over her shoulder with barely concealed excitement, let out a whoop of joy. My dear Miss Sinclair, this is extraordinary. The university has never created such a position before. You would be making history. But Evelyn's attention was caught by a smaller note that had fallen from the official letter. In handwriting, she recognized immediately. It read simply, "Some gifts are best given anonymously, but some dreams deserve the chance to become reality. The choice, as always, is yours. A." Eleanor Blackwood, with the intuition that came from years of observing human nature, studied Evelyn's face carefully. "There's more to this story, isn't there, my dear?" Through tears she couldn't control, Evelyn nodded. "I believe the Duke of Pemberton has just offered me the chance to have everything I've ever wanted professionally, without requiring me to sacrifice anything I value personally." "And what will you do?" Catherine asked, her young face bright with curiosity. Evelyn looked around the breakfast table at the family who had become so dear to her, then at the letter that represented a future she had never dared to imagine. "I think," she said slowly, "I'm going to write a letter of my own." 3 days later, Alexander received a response that made his heart soar with possibilities he had thought lost forever. "Your Grace," it read, "I accept the position, and I accept the friendship of a man who has learned that the greatest nobility lies in lifting others up. Perhaps we cannot change the world we were born into, but we can certainly build a better one together. Most gratefully, E." And so began a partnership that would span decades, transforming not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others. They worked together as colleagues and friends, their shared commitment to education and social justice creating a bond that transcended the social barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. Years later, when historians wrote about the revolutionary changes in women's education during the late Victorian era, they would note the remarkable collaboration between the Duke of Pemberton and the brilliant educator Evelyn Sinclair. What they could never capture in their scholarly accounts was the quiet joy of two people who had found a way to love each other by loving the work they shared, proving that sometimes the greatest romance is the one that changes the world. In the end, they had both learned to bloom where they were planted, discovering that the most beautiful gardens are those cultivated by hands that work together toward a common purpose, regardless of the circumstances that brought them there.